Hello, and thank you for the introduction, and thank you for inviting me to contribute to your conference. I'm sure I'm not the first speaker to express sadness I can't join you in person today. I'm part of a team within the NFU that offers political representation and legal and technical support to our members. So we track and influence, hopefully, developments in farm policy and rulemaking, and we advise our members how to deal with them. And my overriding interest is in food security and the secure supply of water needed to produce it. In my talk to you this afternoon, I'm going to focus on horticultural production, which, as we all know, is of high value, grown to very high quality specifications demanded by the supermarkets. And indeed, any failure to deliver those products on time and on spec is not really an option for our producers. So a secure supply of water is a must, not just for yield, but for crop quality. And our home production is increasingly vulnerable to extreme weather events and water availability. But before I explain the experience here in England, I want to make this fairly obvious point. It's that supermarket demands apply equally to home produced and imported food. And delivering food security is not wholly in the hands of our own farmers in England, because we import fruit and vegetables from countries like Spain that are far more water stressed than we are. This map shows a set of countries that we rely on for imports of fresh produce, all of whom face considerably greater water challenges than we do. And so, while our weather might be making it more difficult for our farmers, it seems to me that we have a comparative advantage over many other countries, because it will continue to rain here, albeit less predictably. So the water use by sector slide. I wanted to make the point that unlike elsewhere in the farming world, farmers here are minor users of abstracted water resources. In England and Wales, we just use 2% of total abstracted water that's dominated by public water supply. And that's what the pie chart shows. But the graph also on that slide highlights the seasonal variation in our water use, common with Jersey, I'm sure, primarily used in the spring and summer, with minimal return to the environment because of the consumptive nature of agricultural use. And those blue bars, they show the increasing amount of water being abstracted in winter for reservoir storage. And we've seen a big increase in the capture of surplus water over the past 20 or 30 years. So if you could move to the next slide for me, please. My next point is that extreme weather events over the past decade have been really challenging for our farmers, and I heard some of that earlier in the conference, your own experiences. We experienced agricultural droughts here in 2011 and 2010, and again in 2018 and 2020. And these were all interspersed with periods of high rainfall and flooding. And dry weather brings with it, of course, the risk not only of unpredictable availability of actual water, but in our experience, the risk of environmental regulations limiting our access to water through irrigation bans. The next slide covers our NFU drought survey. And what this revealed for us, and what was really noticeable during 2018 and 2020, was that agricultural droughts didn't just affect irrigated crops in the south and east, which is traditional, but it affected all farming commodities across the whole country. And you'll see from that list, the survey of our members shows the many ways that they were affected by water shortages, and not all of them actually so obvious as a water-related issue. But they do include increased input costs for example, for labour and feed, and disruption in the timing of practically all farming operations. And the issue I think that we face is that by the time that some of those impacts are recognised on farm, it's often too late to respond to them. My next slide shows how likely it is to get even more unpredictable out there. And that's the slide of future rainfall patterns. This graph predicts changes in rainfall by month projected to the year 2050. And that's compared to current trends, so above and below the horizontal line. And that's represented in the solid bars. But look at the extent of potential variation illustrated by those single lines, because they're the predicted changes in rainfall that could have much more impact and be far more unpredictable than we're used to at the moment. That will, of course, have implications for water resource demand, but they're also likely to impact on things like crop disease pressure throughout the growing year, and will impact maybe across the whole farming operation in terms of things such as drainage management, planting, harvesting times. And so perhaps points towards a more holistic management response to climate change impacts. And indeed, my next slide that I won't dwell on, but that shows us how water availability is likely to change in the longer term future. And the maps show how more likely we are to see our potato areas become more vulnerable, if indeed unsuitable for potato production. That's indicated by the red areas. And particularly those areas are of concern because the growers there tend to rely more on rainfall than irrigation. My next slide shows our abstraction plan. So what I've said up till now shows you that we can see water availability becoming more constrained, and our regulatory regime is doing little to support the farming sector. So we'll continue to ask DEFRA to formally recognise water as an essential use in agriculture to maintain and increase food production. But what are we doing about all this? Well, strategically, government has created a national drought group to bring all the sectors together around the same table: agriculture, water supply, environment and energy. It's supposed to meet only during emergencies, but in practice has met regularly for the past 3 years, which tells us something about what an increasing threat drought is to us. That government group gives farming a voice in an arena normally dominated by public water supply. And it means that messages and communications are consistent across the piece. Meanwhile, our government's abstraction plan is being gradually rolled out on a catchment-based approach, starting with our most water-stressed catchments in the east of the country. The idea is to create local solutions for local problems. And the focus is on joining up farmers to use more water more efficiently and collectively, and link it into work already being done to manage diffuse pollution at the same time. And we're looking to find ways to make the application of water use regulations more flexible and more agile, while continuing to protect the environment and to utilise water before it runs out to sea. Of course, our farmers face a major upheaval as we leave the Common Agricultural Policy and the support it provides behind in favour of public payments for public goods. I suppose the optimistic angle is that change will provide financial opportunities for farmers to adopt land management practices that deliver clean and plentiful water. That's an expression demanded in our Environment Bill, just going back to Parliament as we speak. And there's growing interest from our water companies who are interested in incentivizing farmers to do this as a cheaper alternative to high energy and high carbon methods of treating water to potable. To marry up how we manage both too much water and not enough water at the catchment scale. And so we're seeing a new interest and opportunities to work with environmental sector, public supply sector on ideas around natural flood management and constructed wetlands, for example. My next slide shows my closing good news story, or I suspect that my loss from your screens, I'll move on quite quickly. But this is a good news story. Soft fruit sector in the south of England demonstrates the fantastic progress that can be made by forward planning. In our production of strawberries and raspberries, we've seen significant growth in production, achieved through the use of tabletop operations, precision irrigation and fertilization, and the introduction of new crop varieties, crop housing to achieve earlier growing periods and longer harvests. And that's resulted in a near doubling of trickle irrigation demand. But whilst that involves more water use, on the other hand, some of these businesses are using the most efficient and sustainable water application in the farming sector, consistent, I think, with sustainable business production. And so finally, I'll close with a shortened version of my wish list for moving towards a more sustainable water management in farming. And there's 3 points. Firstly, let's promote more contingency planning amongst farmers to help them better understand the risks of water supply disruption and how to manage it. Secondly, let's develop and promote precision farming and best practice in the management of soil to trap moisture, for example. And finally, let's make sure that we have maximum flexibility to capture and store water to use it when it's actually needed. And that's my conclusion, and thank you for listening.
Much, Paul. Well, lots of ideas there, Paul. The question I've got here, though, is what is the single most important thing that farmers in England are doing to manage water?
Well, the most important thing farmers are doing is finding ways to capture surplus water, to hold it and distribute and use it in times of scarcity. I appreciate that the topography and the field size of Eastern England, for example, are very different to those you have in Jersey. But nevertheless, I think there are opportunities to hold water on fields, in tanks. In this country, that we have issues around the cost and the return on capital. But farmers are now realizing that, well, so things that might not be financially viable to cope with a 1 in 20-year drought event are make much more sense in terms of capital return if those drought events are 1 in 2 and 3 years.
Okay, well, Paul, thank you so much for joining us today. Thanks for bearing with us with the technical glitch there, but great that we could get that working again. And it's been really great hearing from you today.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.